On a crowded subway after a tiring day at work, a kind gesture when a young black man offers his seat to a pregnant woman. Just when it seemed like that good deed would be rewarded, the woman suddenly collapsed and the man became the target of public criticism. What happened next is truly a story that will shock you. The subway platform buzzed with the energy of the evening rush hour. The faint hum of conversations blended with the screech of arriving trains and the rhythmic clatter of hurried footsteps. A young black man, Malcolm Harris, adjusted the strap of his backpack, shifting the weight off his sore shoulder. It had been a long day at the clinic, a steady stream of patients, endless paperwork, and a few tense moments with a particularly grumpy supervisor. But now, as he waited for the train, the thought of finally getting home to check on his mother brought him a sense of relief. The train screeched to a halt, its doors sliding open to release a wave of passengers. Malcolm stepped inside, careful to avoid bumping into anyone, and found a spot near the center of the car. He gripped the overhead bar and glanced around. The car was crowded, filled with a mix of tired commuters, chatty students, and a few tourists clutching maps and backpacks. It didn't take long for his eyes to land on a woman standing just a few feet away. She was visibly pregnant, her swollen belly stretching the fabric of her dress. One hand clutched a pole for balance while the other held an oversized bag that seemed far too heavy for her frame. Her face was flushed, and beads of sweat glistened on her forehead. She looked like she was struggling to keep herself upright as the train jerked forward. Malcolm's instincts kicked in. Without a second thought, he released his grip on the bar and turned toward her. "Mom," he said, his tone kind but firm, "you look like you could use this seat." The woman hesitated, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Oh no, I'm fine," she said, though her trembling legs told a different story. "Please," Malcolm insisted, gesturing to the seat. "It's no trouble." After a moment of hesitation, she nodded gratefully. "Thank you so much," she murmured as she sank into the seat, her relief palpable. Malcolm offered a small smile and moved closer to the door, gripping the pole for balance. He glanced at his watch. If the train stayed on schedule, he'd make it home just in time to help prepare dinner. His mother had been through a lot lately, and he wanted to be there for her. For a brief moment he felt good about his small act of kindness. It wasn't much, but it was something. The world could use more of that. He thought a little kindness to make the day easier for someone else. The train rocked as it approached the next station. Malcolm's eyes drifted to the window, the blur of lights and tunnels mesmerizing in their monotony. He was just beginning to relax when a commotion pulled him back to reality. The woman, the one he had just given his seat to, suddenly slumped forward, her bag slipping from her grasp and falling to the floor. A gasp escaped her lips, barely audible over the hum of the train. Her hands clutched her stomach as her knees buckled, sending her to the ground. "Ma'am," someone shouted. The car froze as heads turned toward the scene. A man in a business suit stepped forward, his face etched with concern. "Is she okay? Someone do something." Malcolm's heart raced. Without hesitation, he moved toward the woman, crouching down beside her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing panic around him. She didn't respond, her breathing shallow and labored. Another passenger yelled for someone to pull the emergency brake, while a third fumbled with their phone, dialing 911. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, the abrupt stop nearly throwing Malcolm off balance. As passengers scrambled to help, the woman raised a trembling hand, pointing directly at Malcolm. Her voice was weak but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. "It was him," she gasped. He did something to me." Malcolm froze, his mind racing to process her words. "What?" The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing the murmurs around him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "I didn't do anything. I just gave you my seat." The woman didn't respond, her breathing growing more labored. The man in the suit who had first stepped forward now turned toward Malcolm, his brow furrowed with suspicion. "I saw him standing close to her," he said. "What were you doing near her bag?" Malcolm blinked, his pulse quickening. "I wasn't near her bag," he said, his voice firm. "I was standing by the door the whole time." But it didn't seem to matter. The atmosphere in the car had shifted, the initial concern for the woman now laced with suspicion. A mother holding a stroller muttered something under her breath, casting a wary glance at Malcolm. An older man with glasses stepped between Malcolm and the woman, as if shielding her from some unseen threat. "Someone call the police," a voice shouted from the back. Malcolm raised his hands defensively, his mind reeling. "Why would you call the cops?" he said, his voice cracking slightly, not from fear, but from sheer frustration. "I didn't do anything. Ask anyone here." The murmurs grew louder, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. Malcolm's words felt like they were falling on deaf ears. A man in the back muttered something about being careful these days, while another shook his head, muttering, "You never know with people." The train doors hissed open, and moments later, 2 transit officers stepped onto the car. Their presence seemed to heighten the tension, the air growing heavier with every second. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Passengers immediately began talking over one another, pointing fingers and giving fragmented accounts of what they thought had happened. "She collapsed," one woman said, nodding toward the pregnant woman. "And he was right there." The officers turned their attention to Malcolm, who stood frozen in place, his hands still raised slightly. One of the officers gestured toward him. "You," he said, "step off the train so we can sort this out." Malcolm's heart sank, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I didn't do anything," he said firmly. "I just gave her my seat. That's it." "We'll figure that out," the officer replied. "Let's go." Malcolm stepped off the train under the watchful eyes of the 2 transit officers. The bustling platform seemed quieter now, the usual chatter replaced by the low hum of murmurs and the occasional click of a phone camera. A small crowd had gathered, passengers spilling out of the subway car to watch the unfolding drama. Malcolm felt their stares bore into him, suspicion painted across their faces like graffiti on a wall. One of the officers, Officer Bradley, was an older man with a gruff demeanor. He adjusted his belt, his gaze scrutinizing Malcolm like a predator sizing up its prey. The younger officer, Officer Rivera, looked less certain. Her brow furrowed as she glanced between Malcolm and the pregnant woman still seated in the car, clutching her stomach as paramedics arrived to assist her. "All right," Bradley barked, flipping open a notepad. "Tell us what happened." Malcolm straightened his posture, his hands still raised slightly in a gesture of non-aggression. "I was sitting on the train," he began, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "I saw the woman standing, and she looked like she was struggling. So, I got up and offered her my seat. That's it. That's all I did." Bradley's eyes narrowed. "And after that?" "After that, I stood by the door," Malcolm said firmly, gesturing toward the train. "I didn't touch her. I didn't touch her bag. I didn't do anything." Bradley didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the crowd behind him. "Anyone see what happened?" he called out. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, reluctant to speak up. Finally, a middle-aged woman in a red coat stepped forward hesitantly. "I saw him," she said, pointing at Malcolm. "He was standing close to her. Maybe too close." "That's not true," Malcolm interjected, his voice rising slightly. "I wasn't near her except when I gave up my seat." The woman shrugged, her expression guarded. "I don't know. It just seemed off." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, each whisper cutting deeper into Malcolm's resolve. A man near the back of the group muttered, "Why would she accuse him if he didn't do anything?" Another added, "You can't be too careful these days." Malcolm's chest tightened. The weight of their words felt suffocating. He glanced toward Officer Rivera, hoping for some sign of understanding, but she looked conflicted, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Look," Malcolm said, his tone more urgent now. "I don't know why she's saying this. Maybe she's confused. Maybe something else is going on, but I didn't do anything to her." Before anyone could respond, one of the paramedics stepped off the train and approached the officers. "She's stable for now," he said. "Looks like dehydration and low blood sugar caused her to collapse. We'll need to take her to the hospital for further evaluation." Rivera's expression softened slightly at the news, but Bradley remained unconvinced. "That doesn't explain why she pointed at him," he said, nodding toward Malcolm. "Excuse me." A new voice rang out, clear and confident, cutting through the tension. The crowd parted slightly to reveal a teenage girl with long braids and a phone in her hand. Jada, who had been sitting near the back of the train, stepped forward. "I saw everything," she said, holding up her phone. He didn't do anything to her. He just gave up his seat. Bradley frowned. And you've got proof of that? Jada nodded, unlocking her phone and scrolling through her videos. I was recording a TikTok when it all happened. Here. She handed the phone to Rivera, who watched the video intently. The footage was shaky but clear. It showed Malcolm standing by the door, his hands gripping the pole, completely uninvolved with the woman or her belongings. The moment he offered his seat was captured, as well as the distance he kept afterward. Rivera turned the phone toward Bradley. It checks out, she said quietly. He didn't touch her. Bradley's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward Malcolm. Even so, he said. His tone gruff, we still need to file a report. Protocol. Malcolm exhaled sharply, relief mingling with frustration. So I'm free to go, he asked. Bradley hesitated before nodding. For now. But stay nearby. We might need to ask you more questions. Malcolm stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. I just proved I didn't do anything, and you're still treating me like I'm guilty. It's protocol, Bradley repeated, his tone clipped. Rivera stepped forward, her voice softer. Look, I'm sorry for what you've been through. We had to make sure. Malcolm shook his head, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Had to make sure of what? That a black man on a train wasn't a threat? Is that what this is about? Rivera looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The paramedics wheeled the woman toward the ambulance, her gaze flicking toward Malcolm as they passed. I'm sorry, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I wasn't thinking straight. Malcolm didn't respond. Her words felt hollow, her apology too late to undo the damage. Around him, the crowd began to thin out, their whispers fading as they moved on with their evening. But Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes on him, the weight of their assumptions still pressing down on his shoulders. He glanced toward Jada, who stood nearby, her phone still in hand. Thanks for speaking up, he said, his voice strained but sincere. Jada shrugged. People were being unfair. It wasn't right. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Malcolm appreciated more than he could express. As she walked away, he felt a pang of gratitude but also a nagging thought. What if she hadn't been there? What if no one had spoken up? As Malcolm stood on the platform, waiting for the next train, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He had done nothing wrong, only shown kindness to someone in need, and yet he had been treated like a criminal. The platform was quiet now, but the weight of the earlier accusations still hung in the air. Malcolm clenched his fists, his father's voice echoing in his mind. The world will judge you, son, no matter how good you are. But don't let it break you. He straightened his shoulders and exhaled slowly. He wouldn't let it break him. But he couldn't ignore the bitter truth of what had just unfolded. Malcolm boarded the next train, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The compartment was less crowded now, with only a few passengers scattered across the seats. He found a spot near the back, slumping into the hard plastic bench. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened train window, his face tense, his jaw clenched. He tried to relax, but the tension in his chest refused to ease. The train rumbled forward, but Malcolm's mind was stuck in reverse, replaying the events over and over. The accusations, the stares, the murmurs, they clung to him like shadows, impossible to shake. He could still feel Officer Bradley's scrutinizing glare, hear the murmured doubts of the crowd, and see the fear in Rachel's eyes when she pointed at him. He clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening. I didn't do anything. Why is it so hard for people to see that? When Malcolm finally reached his stop, he stepped onto the platform and made his way toward his apartment building. The familiar streets offered little comfort tonight, their quiet stillness amplifying the noise in his head. By the time he reached his front door, his exhaustion felt bone deep. As he opened the door, the smell of chicken soup and fresh cornbread greeted him, wafting from the small kitchen. His mother, Margaret Harris, sat at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as Malcolm entered, her face lighting up briefly before her expression turned concerned. You're late, she said, her voice soft but laced with worry. Everything okay? Malcolm hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, not after everything she had already been through with her surgery. I got held up on the train, he said, forcing a small smile. It's nothing. Margaret's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. Doesn't sound like nothing. Sit down, Malcolm. He sighed but obeyed, pulling out a chair across from her. As he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, Margaret reached out and placed a hand over his. "Talk to me, baby. What happened?" Malcolm hesitated again, but her steady gaze broke through his defenses. Slowly, he recounted the evening's events, the act of kindness, the accusations, the arrival of the police, and the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. By the time he finished, Margaret's hand had tightened around his, her grip firm but trembling slightly. "That's not right," she said, her voice trembling with quiet anger. "You didn't deserve that." "No, I didn't," Malcolm replied, his voice low, "but it happened anyway. And the worst part, most of them didn't even need proof. They just decided." Margaret exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "People don't see the person in front of them, Malcolm. They see what they've been taught to see. And too many of them have been taught the wrong things." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted. "How quick they were to assume I'd done something wrong. Even when that girl showed them the video, they didn't want to let it go. They just moved on like it didn't matter." Margaret's expression softened. "It matters, Malcolm. It matters because you did the right thing, even when they didn't. You stayed calm, you told the truth, and that girl, you inspired her to stand up for what was right. That's not nothing." "But it's not enough," Malcolm said, his voice breaking slightly. "How many people get accused like that and don't have someone there to back them up? What happens to them?" Margaret's hand tightened on his again. "That's why you keep going, Malcolm. Because the world won't change overnight. But every time you choose to stand tall, every time you prove them wrong, you make it just a little harder for them to hold on to their hate." The next morning, Malcolm sat on his small balcony, sipping a cup of coffee as the sun crept over the skyline. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on his mind, but he was determined not to let them consume him. His phone buzzed repeatedly, a constant stream of notifications from social media. Jada's video had gone viral overnight, reaching far beyond their city. The comments section was flooded with mixed reactions: outrage at how quickly people had judged Malcolm, gratitude toward Jada for standing up, and a deep conversation about the assumptions that society often makes. This man deserved better. We all deserve better. Bias is everywhere. It's time we start acknowledging it and doing something about it. It's heartbreaking that a simple act of kindness can turn into this. We need to do better. Malcolm scrolled through the comments, his emotions a swirl of gratitude, frustration, and quiet hope. He paused on a comment from someone who claimed to have been on the train. "I was there. I didn't speak up, and I regret it. Seeing this video made me realize how wrong I was to stay silent. I'm sorry." The words hit him harder than he expected. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He hadn't needed an apology from anyone on that train, but knowing that at least one person had reflected on their actions brought a small sense of peace. Later that day, Malcolm decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The fresh air helped clear his mind, and he welcomed the simplicity of the everyday sights: children playing on the sidewalk, a street vendor selling roasted peanuts, and a couple walking hand in hand. As he passed a local coffee shop, he spotted a familiar face sitting by the window. It was Officer Rivera, dressed in plain clothes and holding a notebook. She didn't see him, but her serious expression and the way she tapped her pen against the page told him she was deep in thought. Malcolm didn't approach her. He didn't need to. He could sense that she, too, was processing the events of the previous day. For all her initial hesitation, Rivera had shown a willingness to reflect, a trait that, Malcolm realized, was rare but invaluable. Over the following days, Jada's video continued to gain traction. News outlets picked it up, and conversations about implicit bias and systemic racism began to surface in unexpected places. Malcolm even received a message from a local community leader, asking if he would be willing to speak at an upcoming town hall about his experience. At first he hesitated. Did he really want to relive that moment in front of a crowd? But then he thought about his mother's words. Every time you prove them wrong, you make it harder for them to hold on to their hate. He replied with a simple, "I'll be there." Back at the subway station, life went on. People still rushed to catch their trains, and the hum of activity was as constant as ever. But something subtle had shifted. Some of the passengers who had been there that night now looked at strangers with a little less suspicion, their minds lingering on what they had seen in Jada's video. Even Officer Bradley, though he would never admit it out loud, found himself hesitating before jumping to conclusions. As he stood on the platform during his next shift, he noticed a young man helping an elderly passenger with her bags. For a fleeting moment, Bradley felt the familiar tug of suspicion, but he caught himself. Not everyone's up to something, he thought. Sometimes people are just kind. Malcolm knew that the world wouldn't change overnight. The biases he had faced on that train weren't new, and they wouldn't disappear simply because of one viral video. But as he prepared to speak at the town hall, he felt a quiet determination settle within him. Kindness, he realized, wasn't just about the actions you took, it was about resilience. About choosing to rise above the judgment and mistrust, no matter how heavy they weighed. When the day of the town hall arrived, Malcolm stood in front of a small but attentive crowd. His voice was steady as he recounted his story, but it was the message he left them with that lingered long after. We can't control the assumptions people make about us, but we can control how we respond. We can choose kindness even when it's hard. And maybe, just maybe, that choice will inspire others to see us, not through the lens of their biases, but as people. The crowd applauded, and Malcolm felt a small but profound sense of hope. The fight for justice wasn't over, but he wasn't fighting alone. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.